Okay, it's 12 o'clock here in Brussels. Let's start. We don't have all the speakers. Okay, I think nearly all the speakers should be here. So welcome everybody. I am Hannah Knappe. I'm the head of climate action at ECDPM. Happy to see so many of you joined for our COP29 debrief on adaptation, finance and diplomacy through a Europe-Africa lens. This webinar is co-organized by ECDPM, Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and you will hear from them in a minute. Now, COP29 ended with the Baku finance goal, which aims to mobilize $300 billion annually by 2035, which is a tripling of the previous goal. But from an adaptation point of view, our assessment is not so positive. There is, for example, no subgoal for adaptation. But still, we hear that perspectives on the final outcome differ, and that's why it's so important to have today's conversation. We only have an hour and a half and a lineup of 8 fantastic speakers, so we will have to be quite strict with time management. The session will also be recorded and will be shared afterwards. Now, just to make sure, we have the honor to have Mr. Ali Mohammed, Kenya's climate envoy and the chair of the African Group of Negotiators here with us. Normally, I see a lot of people are joining, and I'm not 100% sure if Mr. Mohammed is already here with us. In case he's not here yet, we could start with the first session and then invite Mr. Mohammed to give his presentation in between 2 sessions. So in case he's not here, it's a bit difficult for me to have the full overview. Mr. Mohammed, if you are here, please do unmute yourself and you can speak. Otherwise, we move to the first session on adaptation finance. The second one will, in the second one, we will discuss adaptation diplomacy. So I think the best way is to start right away with the first session. And I would like to invite Katie Brown, team leader, International Climate Risk and Adaptation from Stockholm Environment Institute, as a moderator and also to introduce the speakers. So thank you, Katie, please.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you're joining from. Yeah, as Hannah said, I am a research fellow and a team lead at the Stockholm Environment Institute, where I focus on, among other things, adaptation finance. So it's a great pleasure to be joined by a wonderful panel today. I'll introduce everyone and then dive right into questions because I'm very interested to hear their perspective. So we're joined by Mithika Mwende, who is director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Also Martha Bekele, who is the co-founder of Development Transformations, or DevTransform. And finally, Cristina Rumbaitis Del Rio, who is senior advisor on adaptation and resilience for the UN Foundation. So I'm going to start first with Mithika and ask, just reflecting on COP29, Hannah just said there are many different perspectives on this outcome. I would say they really span the spectrum. What do you think are the main barriers to making progress on the NCQG agenda or the new climate finance goal in general from the perspective of African civil society? Mithika, I know you're here. Feel free to turn on your camera and come in. Maybe not.
I see that Mithika is here, but he maybe has trouble unmuting himself.
We'll give it one more second. All right, okay, we'll carry on while we sort out the technical logistics there. So I'm going to turn to Martha and maybe ask the same question. What do you think is needed to make progress on the NCQG agenda from your perspective?
Yeah, so any discussion should be situated in contextualizing what is happening geopolitically, because we're expecting a pessimistic point of view because of insular politics, the rise of insular politics, and the likelihood of budgets being cut under the Trump administration. That is one. The other contextualizing framework should be that we need to learn from the 100 billion per year in the past. Where did we go wrong? Because what we had was terrible quality of finances, where, for instance, in one of the assessments I did for 2022 projects, I realized that more than half of African least developed countries actually were borrowing, you know. These are least developed countries borrowing for climate action. So the inadequacy and of course accounting tricks and the games of numbers, false tagging, and so on. So, and the late meeting, if it was met at all, the 100 billion, which was of course widely discredited. So as we move to NCQG, you know, for some they say that it was better than expected but less than hoped. For me, it seemed like the deal that we got is less than or worse than having a no deal. Because of the insufficiency, we're talking about a quarter, less than a quarter, 23% of the ask being agreed on, at least in the if you're talking about the inner layer compared to the 1.3 trillion. When you are accounting for inflation, we even realize that this is way lower. It is also, you know, an opportunity yet again to enrich capitalists, because you're talking about co-investment to be counted with public resources. Now, you did not invite me, I'm sure, you know, to continue lamenting and talking about the barriers, but what needs to be done to facilitate achieving this, at least whatever deal we got. Time and again, even those of you who were at COP29, you've heard the submissions from the Global South that we need to have a common definition of climate finance, period. Because no one knows what climate finance is as we speak now. Hence, there is that repurposing, there is that recirculating old money. In one of the assessments I did, for instance, I found my own country, Ethiopia, got huge grant. You know, it was the first top country to receive a grant for climate, yeah, if I'm not mistaken, for adaptation. But upon further investigation, you realize that that is money given for post-conflict, post-war recovery. So no one knows what is climate finance. And we need to be clear on this if we really want to genuinely provide and access the amount that is promised under NCQG. The other is, it is one thing to have a common definition, but another also to have a common and standardized methodology and a sharper one, of course, beyond the yes or no accounting mechanism. You know, it should not be, is this climate finance, and is it primary or significant, or the way we do it, principal and significant. Instead of that, we need to have a sharper one, because in one of the studies we did in the past, for instance, we found that about $5 billion, that is 20% of World Bank projects, were tagged wrongly as climate finance. So those are on transparency, but when it comes to accessibility, on equity and quality, of course, many have discussed in the past the lengthy process to access these finances. I mean, they take 8 to 10 years, you know, in total disregard that climate change actually is time sensitive. So there was a talk actually even in Baku on the reform of the GCF and other funding mechanisms and so on. But I mean, these are the things that I can talk about, you know. I mean, the common definition, the methodology, beyond transparency, how do we enhance also accessibility, you know, how do we make it less rigid, and countries, especially least developed countries, can access easily by making technical requirements less.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that many would agree that the COP did not do much to advance transparency and in the definitions and in the methodologies. Christina, I'm going to turn to you. Ahead of COP29, you wrote that the opportunity cost of an action is far too high, but many of the concrete suggestions that you and others had before the COP have not been followed through. So looking forward, what would be the one key innovative mechanism to mobilize adaptation finance effectively ahead of COP30 and maybe beyond as well?
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. I do think there was a large cost to inaction and a big disappointment coming out of COP29. I won't sugarcoat that. But I don't think all hope is lost, and I do think we need to really start looking at how to mainstream adaptation finance much more broadly into other financing flows. I guess a little bit of good news is the IDA replenishment that happened earlier this month. I think 23 billion were committed, which gets leveraged into 100 billion, which was more or less the target that was set out. This is highly concessional finance, so at least that target was somewhat met. Although you could argue that it should be much bigger. But what's important about IDA finance is that at least 35% of it is estimated to have adaptation and mitigation co-benefits. And so obviously, I think that number should be closer to 100%. But we need to find the opportunities to really mainstream climate action, climate concerns into all streams of development finance, and including innovative financing mechanisms. And I think looking to the year ahead, we have the Financing for Development Conference in June into July. I think that's a significant opportunity to get these key messages around integrating adaptation finance into broader development finance streams. We also have 20 leadership from South Africa, really looking to prioritize adaptation finance. So I look forward to hearing more about that. I think that's a significant opportunity. And then you have all of these innovative finance mechanisms that are being talked about, whether it's a global wealth tax, solidarity levies, or in the Maritime Organization, a levy or economic mechanism to help support decarbonization of the maritime industry. Well, can we not also look at the resilience of the maritime industry at the same time and see if some of those funds that would be going to building new ports with new fuels could also be deployed to making more resilient ports and more resilient shipping industry, which of course has big potential knock-on effects for instance, for food security and livelihood security as well. So I think we need to start engaging as a community in these spaces that maybe are beyond the climate COPs and beyond the climate space, but bringing the climate message and the urgent need of adapting. We're in a much warmer world than we were. Climate change is here. We need to be adapting to it, and that requires finance. And then just one last point. I raise this not to absolve developed countries from their commitments and under the Paris Agreement, and at least meeting their 300 billion commitment and beyond, but just to say we need to go beyond that because the needs are so great. And as Martha pointed out, we really missed and came in far short than we should have at COP29. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to turn back to Mithika and see if you can come in now. I'd like to hear, your reflections on the main barriers to making progress, perhaps in reflecting as well on what Christina and Martha have shared about the potential for financial mechanisms and or innovative mechanisms, and then also the need for greater transparency and clarity on accounting.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Catherine, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining this, and we are very glad to start to close the year on this very important conversation. I think just speaking from where my colleagues have left, just to confirm that all is agreed that the COP29 was a failure. There are those who are not accepting it, but really it was a flop based on the preparedness which we had, and we thought that it could deliver a quantum which was really receptive to everybody. And the drama which played out during the last few minutes, the last hours of the COP really was not what we expected. But that is water under the bridge. We need to soldier on. We'll continue fighting. And I agree with Christina that we need really to change the strategy. How do we build a stronger community to push for this, what we want? Time and again, we have looked into, really locked ourselves in the silo of climate space without really trying to see how the global geopolitical landscape is changing, and then changing with it and really expanding our scope. That is what we have not been able to do. And I'm really receptive of the idea that we need to go beyond the climate community. We need to bring the economic justice campaigners. We need to work with debt campaigners. We need to work with tax justice campaigners. We need to work with the young people. We need to bring on board those who are working on the reform of international financial architecture, and then really look at where do we have really to bring them on board so that they can help us in really driving this campaign. And so just to mention that we have discussions with some of these movements under the economic justice campaign we are doing. And we will be happy to discuss beyond this webinar how and share the progress which we have made so that we can bring the colleagues on board and drive that in the Belem Roadmap, which we are discussing at global level with this. We started this during the UN Civil Society Conference in Nairobi, and we have been having convenings, webinars, and physical, including during the UN Summit of the Future, and even some convenings during the COP29. I think I will be happy to really see. Now I'm giving an answer to what Christina said, that we need to bring those communities because we need really to fight hard, and we cannot fight alone. We cannot work in silos. And related to then that then also we also need to map the key moments, because we need to look at this roadmap as a process and look at the COP30 not as an event, but a process which fits into each other. And then there are very critical moments, like, for instance, we are thinking about moving to the fourth FFD4, financing for development in Spain. What about the UN Social Summit in Qatar later in the year? And what about the UN General Assembly? Somebody has mentioned the G20 meeting in South Africa. So we are already mapping up this, and we would want to see how we can work together to draw our common actions and the common roadmaps which we can work. So that's point number one, just to add on what colleagues have said, that what we need to do. The other point, in my view, what we need to do is, I think we need to look at the entire global landscape. Be conscious when it comes to money, it is going to be very difficult because of the growing influence of the right-wing movement, particularly in Europe and in the US, where now climate deniers are taking the fulcrums of leadership. What does that play out when we talk about public money and climate finance? Is it going really to be feasible? That being the case, because some of these actually are resistant to progressive ideas like climate action, migration, and those others. Yet they are the ones now who are allocating money and who are providing. Are they going to accept this? This is another question. So looking into that, we need to analyze and really be realistic on what we can achieve towards that. Then the final point is taking advantage of the review, the submission of NDCs by countries, NDC 3.0, 2031 and 2035, and which is going to be done by next year. So how is it going to work? So I want to end it there. There are so many ideas which are flying out, and we want really to see how we can work together really to drive to really reinvigorate and re-energize people, because people are at their lowest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really wonderful to hear you reflect also on how this is a process, and COP29 is just one stop along that process. I'm going to turn back now to Martha and ask a question that's been at the top of my mind through the past few speakers, is about the political feasibility of some of these innovative financial mechanisms. You know, we talk about the billionaires tax, and also shipping, maritime, and aviation emissions. Some of these things are explicit carve-outs from the Paris Agreement, so they've been sort of politically sequestered before. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about, you know, the potential for these types of funding arrangements to gain political traction. We've seen it to a certain extent, but how do we turn it into something tangible? And do you have any examples of innovative approaches that are already sort of showing promise or yielding funding?
Thankfully, I'm not in the second session of diplomacy, so I can be as politically incorrect as I would want. Not really, because to me, certain discussions disguised as innovative mechanisms are there to enrich and entrench the global capitalist system. One of them, maybe it will be mentioned later, is carbon markets. It is being fronted as a source of financing, for instance, innovative financing mechanism, which is basically giving permissions to pollute more while mitigating somewhere else. So to me, if this is a question about mobilizing and providing genuine financing beyond greenwashing, genuine financing to provide quality financing, then we need to recognize that this can come only when you overhaul the whole global architecture, the whole system that disfavors most countries in the global south. I'm talking about taxes and development financing, and even the possibility of litigation, because basically what is happening in the climate finance landscape is a perfect reflection of the mess that we find ourselves in the global order, the way we've organized ourselves. So I will speak just a bit in a few seconds. For instance, tax initiatives, you know, how do we mobilize? Because Christine was talking about, for instance, the carbon-based wealth tax and windfall taxes and so on. One of them for Africa, which is more relevant to Africa, is the huge sum of money that is going out of this continent, illicit financial flows. We're talking about $88.6 billion per year. Okay, so one of the innovative approaches that we will see, for instance, that will mobilize for us more would be the adoption of, for instance, the terms of reference for fairer global tax regulations, which was adopted this August this year. So under the UN Tax Convention, maybe there is hope that when it is fully operationalized, then it can actually generate money that is much needed for development and climate. So that is one in the global discourse, and there is that initiative that has started. So how do we come in? Instead of being siloed and thinking about climate finance and how do we get climate finance, how do we join forces with other global processes that have started? And this is one of them, the UN Tax Convention. The second approach that I see for better and more mobilization and provision of climate finance is going beyond reform talks, because what we have now with the MDB, the Multilateral Development Bank, IFI reform, is just a band-aid to the system. How do we prolong the life of this global system? which is disguised as reform. Rather, there are now talks, especially among academicians, among scholars, and even practitioners, that the role of these MDBs should be strengthening state-owned national development banks. How do you make them AAA rated, for instance, so that they are the ones that are lending in local currency and expecting payment in local currency? So these are the real talks that we need to have, touching on global processes and linking climate finance talks to the reality of the global order. And lastly, of course, I need to mention, I'm sure it will be mentioned later, is what is happening in the International Court of Justice. More than 100 countries and organizations were giving testimonies, just last week. It was concluded on Friday. So this is, although we are expecting just an advisory note from the ICJ, but it's going to leave us with precedence, because the way things are, and as I said earlier, the insular politics, the inward-looking politics, and the change in geopolitics may force us to think of litigation, and that could be the future of mobilizing better climate finance, because that may be the reality that we are facing, given what is happening in the world. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Martha. I want to just, before I turn to Christina, encourage audience members to submit questions in the chat. We should have some time at the end of this session to take questions, so don't be shy. So Christina, I'll turn to you now. Martha just highlighted the need to overhaul the international or multilateral financial architecture. And I think a few years ago, we saw a lot of momentum around this with the Summit for the Global Financial Pact and the Evolution Roadmap from the World Bank. But I think that there's a sense now that it's slowed or maybe even stalled. And so I'm wondering how we might reinvigorate this agenda in 2025, especially in light of what Martha said about the importance of this reform.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Martha. I think this is much more about reforming the whole system rather than tweaking different parts and expecting significant change to come from it. However, even though things may seem stall, I feel that IFI reform is a train that has left the station, and is not something that is going to be put aside or not reckoned with. Because I think there's just such a different level of awareness now about the debt distress, about the rules of the game being written in a way that really undermines the prosperity and development and climate resilience and climate action, that I don't think that can be just swept neatly under the rug. That being said, I do think there is a process that's needed to reinvigorate. I think there's some opportunities. Again, we mentioned earlier, and Mithika also mentioned the Financing for Development conference coming later next year. This is definitely on the agenda for the G20 and will remain so. I think even the global goal on adaptation kind of spells out, which to me was one of the brighter lights of COP29, was to see progress on the global goal on adaptation and the work program to develop indicators for targets that were agreed last year. Those targets really spell out how to integrate adaptation into different sectors, into health, into livelihoods and poverty reduction, into water and sanitation and food and agriculture, and beyond. And so I think if we can really hold up those goals and use them to motivate action and mainstream finance, where we will get to a better place. So that being said, I think there's a lot of work to be done to reinvigorate that discussion. A lot of the primary sort of proponents, Barbados, France, Kenya, are in slightly more difficult positions, but still championing this agenda. And I think the list of champions will be growing, even if there is some significant opposition or lack of interest among certain countries. So I think it's important that we keep it on the agenda as civil society. It's important that we look for those entry points and continue to champion this. And hopefully we'll see progress in the year ahead, rather than a little bit of stalling, as you said, Katie. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn back to Mitika now and ask a question from the chat, actually, which is, how does climate finance empower grassroots stakeholders and align with local level accountability and monitoring of climate projects? And I might add to that, not just how does it, but how should it, from your perspective? Oh, maybe we're having trouble unmuting again.
No. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So for many years, we have been grappling how to connect the policy processes we have been making at the UNFCCC level, at all levels, to the really people at the front line of climate justice. This is, to us, an imperative of climate justice, that we give stronger voice to the people who are directly being affected, and empower them and really promote their solutions. That has been the biggest challenge, because when you talk about adaptation and resilience building, that is where it happens. Yet that has never really been the case at international level. And so these processes, I think we need really to focus on that, and that is where the disconnect has been. And so what we have been doing, and our sense is that there are many communities of practice which have been evolving, like the communities of practice for locally led climate action, which is being tried in many countries, like the country I come from. Really, you see there are things which are working at governmental and intergovernmental level. And these are innovations which really we need to tap into and see how we can replicate. They may not be perfect 100%, but at least they are giving us a snapshot on what needs to be done at the local level. So we as a community, particularly in adaptation, when trying to have the GGA global goal on adaptation, we will ask ourselves, how much do we really get the voices of the people, the indigenous communities, smallholder farmers at the local level, the young people, and pastoralist communities. So these are some of the things which we have been trying to do. But at global level, sadly, it's just rhetoric on money. But there has been really a problem of where does that money go, and do we have accountability mechanisms? How do we hold the governments accountable? You see the report of the OECD, for instance. They say they have met their $100 billion US, and very frankly, that is what will happen even as we fight for a better quantum, the $300 billion US. What is going to go to adaptation? What is going to go to mitigation? And mitigation is a priority for Africa. So we have really a long way to go. We have a bitter fight to fight with those people who do not really believe in adaptation. Adaptation is just a footnote in everything they do. And even in the negotiation, that's what you are seeing. There is no really, it is never given priority. And these are the challenges which we need really to really address as we move to the roadmap and moving forward, really to even move to the Belem and elsewhere.
Thank you, Mitika. I think just building on that final point, we've heard several times in this conversation about the $300 billion commitment under the new climate finance goal, but there's also the $1.3 trillion scaled up finance. And the goal lays out this Baku to Belem roadmap. And so I'm wondering, maybe just a final round of comments from each panelist. What do we need to happen under this roadmap in 2025 to ensure that we don't lose focus on adaptation and adaptation finance? And maybe I'll just...
Let me start from there because I'm still unmuted. I don't know what my gadget is really as a problem. So this the one roadmap to $1.3 trillion. I think how I make of it is that we are put in a goose chase. Every time the international community fails to fulfill their obligation, they have to have diversionary tactics. That's how we see it. But we also look at this as an opportunity to really put our spotlight on the prize, what we wanted. So I started by saying that we have already in conversation with very many partner organizations and network sector thematic to build a momentum towards this goal. So we can take advantage of that because that will be the rallying point of the movement, climate movement, but we also be able to look at what is happening out there under the economic justice campaign, and then we ensure that how we can also be part of that, but use this roadmap really to ensure that it is embraced by all campaigners in all sectors and thematic areas.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to save a couple minutes for Christina and Martha, but thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Martha and ask what you think about the Baku to Belem roadmap and the way to maintain focus on adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, with the outlier that you mentioned, for instance, countries, developing countries are also voluntarily, they are invited to voluntarily contribute. There are countries that are actually doing their more than fair share, and there are those that are getting away, of course, not only with the current, but even with their historical emissions. As non-state actors, I think the much we can do is continue putting pressure on our political elites, on our negotiators, as Mithika was saying, not lose focus, but also, as I said, please link your activism and your knowledge products with other ongoing initiatives. As I said, the tax initiative, for instance, the debt relief initiative, and the reform agenda. All this. Don't treat climate and climate financing in a siloed manner. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And to Christina for the final word.
Oh, I can't say anything better than what Martha just said about don't treat climate finance in a siloed manner. I guess I would just add, don't let this be another talk shop. We can't afford, and that there just isn't the energy for another talk shop process. It needs to be a real roadmap that actually charts a path to getting to the 1.3 trillion that is realistic, that is equitable, and that has adaptation as a full part of it, and not just an afterthought or a side sort of project that, as we've seen in so many of these other initiatives. So that would be my steer or my plea for civil society to ensure this isn't just another talk shop. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks to all of our panelists. I think it was a really interesting discussion. I'm going to hand back over to Hannah. I'm just going to say that unfortunately we didn't have the time to address the question in the chat about whether we were serious, but I will say I'll take the moderator's prerogative that I think we see in many cases that things happen slowly and then all at once. And so it may seem impossible that meaningful reform of what are, I think many agree, unjust frameworks. It may seem impossible until it's not. And so I at least would say that it's not a joke. I would say that it's serious and that it has potential. So Just with that, I'll hand it back over to Hannah and say thanks to all of our panelists for a great conversation.
Okay, thank you, Katie, and thank you also from my side to all panelists in the first session. So we are now moving on to the second session, where I think there is quite some overlap with the first one, but we will look at the adaptation agenda through the lens of diplomacy between Europe and Africa. So let me first introduce to you our four speakers. We have first Julius Ngoma, who is National Coordinator at Civil Society Network on Climate Change from Malawi. Then we will welcome Peter Withoek, head of the Belgian delegation at COP29. Third speaker will be Chiara Martinelli, director from CAN Europe. And then last but not least, Julien de Smet, policy officer for Sub-Saharan Africa from DG Klima from the European Commission. Before we start our discussion, I want to apologize on behalf of Mr. Ali Mohammed, who we had invited as a keynote speaker, because he was just invited this morning to another meeting, and unfortunately he cannot be here with us today. But first, so I would like to turn to Julius, representing the African Civil Society for Climate Change, I think working closely also with Mitika from Pakya. So Julius, from your perspective, how do you see the outcome of COP29 specifically for the adaptation agenda? And do you feel that as a CSO representative, you have been able to make an impact on the agenda? If not, then what has been blocking your work? So thank you, Julius. You can unmute yourself and we should be able to hear you then. Okay, I heard that there has been a technical issue. Julius just dropped out, so he should be able to join us hopefully again soon. But so let me turn then to Peter. So I will have a first question for you, Peter. So at COP29, Europe, the European Union has been quite vocal about enlarging the contributors base, emphasizing the need for emerging economies like China, India, Saudi Arabia to take on greater responsibility in climate finance. And in a recent interview with you, I read that was during the first week of COP29, I read that you mentioned there was a certain level of resistance from these economies in showing solidarity with the most vulnerable countries. So where did we end at COP29? What do you expect in the run-up to COP30 specifically on this? And how would you propose bridging the gap between developed countries, emerging economies? So yes, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Before going to that specific question, if I may, Hannah, I would briefly reflect on the discussions in the previous session, which frankly I found very encouraging. I was prepared to make a speech here about the need to overcome the polarization in the discussions around the NCQG and the things I've heard from Mitika notably and other speakers as well, that it's water under the bridge and we have to move on with what we have, especially looking outside of the UNFCCC silo, looking at all processes that are relevant beyond climate change from maybe a narrowly defined perspective, looking at the entire landscape, because that I think is exactly what we need to do in the year ahead before Belem. And more specifically, of course, in the context of the Baku to Belem roadmap to 1.3 trillion. And well, looking very much forward to how notably the Brazilian incoming presidency is going to manage that process. And I don't speak on behalf of the European Union, of course. We still have to have our own reflection about how to move on. But from a Belgian perspective, we would definitely argue that the European Union take a very constructive position in this discussion, looking at all processes, but also making our process, the UNFCCC process, talk to all actors, not just the processes that are mentioned in the invitation, but all actors. Now, about the very specific question that you put before me, well, not only the European Union, there was a broader set of parties who were arguing for expanding the group of contributors to climate finance for the obvious reasons of responsibility and capability. We're talking about some of the, well, largest emitters, largest economies, but also we're also looking at basically the richest countries in the world. So this is also beyond the unproductive, I think, north-south polarization that we saw in Baku and ahead of Baku. I would also note in this context, I know this conference is about adaptation, but that on the side of mitigation from some of these countries, notably, some emerging economies, well, some have emerged already and have become the richest countries on the planet, as I said, an absolute resistance to making progress on the mitigation agenda as part of the global stocktake or broader. That is something I would add into the mix here as being relevant. Now, how to bridge the gap between developed countries and emerging economies, that is a very good question, and a question that we discussed with these emerging economies at length and in depth in Baku. And frankly, the best we could get is what you see reflected in the NCQG decision coming out of Baku. We had, as Belgium proposed, that the money that is flowing from south to south, the money that is flowing in the broader economy, investments that are flowing, foreign direct aid that is flowing from these emerging economies to developing countries, to the most vulnerable countries, be aligned in their entirety with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, etc., but not to no avail. So this is not a satisfactory answer to your question. It does remain very relevant, of course, and it now remains to be seen to what extent our partners from the emerging economies will be willing to provide transparency on their direct aid, on direct investments flowing from their economies to the economies in the south, notably in Africa, and to see to what extent this voluntary, I shouldn't call it commitment, but the voluntary nature of their action expected from the NCQG decision materializes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Peter. This was already a very good first answer to this question. I think we will continue discussing it in a minute with Julia from the European Commission. But before, I just heard that Julius from Malawi has been able to join us again. So Julius, if you're here, please unmute yourself. The question for you would be, from your perspective, so as I said earlier, representing the African civil society on the climate agenda, how do you see the outcome of COP29, specifically for adaptation? Do you feel that you have been able to have an impact on the agenda, or what was blocking your work? Julius, can you, I hear some...
Thank you, Hannah.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Please, the floor is yours. We just heard you. It should work fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you for the question. And all right. So I was, can you hear me? Okay. So I was to say thank you for doing it and to also reflect on the outcomes of the COP29, particularly issue of adaptation and adaptation finance. Although I was also preparing to actually answer a different question, but I think I will try my best to reflect on this one. I think we have seen, we all know what happened the first week of, at least for some of us who were part of the preparatory sessions as part of the least developed countries and Africa group, and we see already the impact of, example, the US elections in the first week, because when we're trying to prepare and you start talking about, financing in general and adaptation financing, already you could have you could see the waves of changes that would actually be a process, and that had us as some of the countries, for example, in the least developed countries in Africa, already started to shake on what kind of outcome we are going to expect on climate finance in general, the NCQG, but also on the issue of adaptation finance. But it's very important that as we are of the fact that we still don't have an agreed definition on what climate finance is. And this is one thing that we did not really advance at COP29, because that left us already with a very huge gap in terms of how do we understand all of the landscape that we talked about here, and how are we going to also be advancing issues to do with the adaptation finance in general, so that we're able to understand each other and cultivate that kind of global cooperation moving forward on how financing has to be treated. So, but we just to also build on what the other colleague indicated in the other session, the issue of the indicators on finance, particular indicators on under the global goal on adaptation was something that we would actually celebrate. The challenges still remain that we still need on implementation when it comes to adaptation, and that would also mean moving forward we should be able to see how best we are going to be tracking adaptation finance, and then ensure there's a general ambition that is being raised on the issue of adaptation finance. But there's also need for looking at what we've gathered so far. Of course, when you look at what has been committed or pledged under adaptation finance and the finance in general, it's generally minimal and very low as compared to what we anticipated, looking at the gap in terms of adaptation finance that is supposed to come, for example, to the developing countries. So that is already a big strategy moving forward that would help us to raise ambition on the issue in itself. So that would actually mean, for instance, if we are talking about global cooperation, maybe cooperation that should be there between the African Union or Africans and the Europeans, then we might need one to even find who could be the champions, for example, in Europe, that would actually help us to, profile the issue of adaptation finance. We've learned what already from the process of loss and damage fund. We've seen for the last 2 or 3 years where one country which has been there to actually champion loss and damage, which is Scotland, how Scotland was able to actually motivate other countries to come in to provide resources, for example, for loss and damage. We still need, in the absence of, for example, if there's not going to be more commitment pledges, let's say from the US, then Europe has to step up. We need champions that would actually be able to provide, to come in to provide additional, support towards adaptation, but even champion adaptation agenda in general. We've seen so many programs that are being implemented, for example, in Africa, in the name of adaptation, but we haven't seen more of the countries, for example, from Europe, who are coming out clearly to say this is what we are already providing, and we are actually supporting, and we can meet this gap in terms of financing towards adaptation. So beyond that, I think we can always find a way on how leveraging on the summits that can happen, Africa EU summits, leveraging on the various meetings and conferences that can be there between Africans and the Europeans. We can find very good strategies of how we can actually strengthen, for example, the capacity of the delegates from Africa to be able to understand and also advance multilateral diplomacy to ensure that we increase perhaps our efficiency and effectiveness in terms of negotiating on better deals that can actually benefit developing countries, but also Africa. But in general, I think I can say that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julius. I'm happy you bring up the role of the US and the implications of that, the anticipated withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement, the implications on the climate finance agenda. I think it's something that we didn't speak about much so far. So, and probably it would be very good to have a dedicated session on what this means for the climate finance agenda for Europe-Africa collaboration in 2025. Now I would like to turn to Chiara from CAN Europe. So my question for you, Chiara, would be, during COP29, CAN Europe was very explicit, emphasizing the importance of stronger European leadership in the climate negotiations. Now, reflecting back on the conference, how do you assess ultimately the EU's leadership in driving progress on adaptation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everyone for the invitation and for this exchange. So maybe before starting replying to the question, just to highlight that, thank you also Julius and the other speakers earlier. Like, I think working with African civil society organization is really key, like in not losing the compass on the ultimate goal of our discussion on adaptation finance, that is ensuring climate justice and is ensuring that all Paris Agreement principles are a need to remain our compass also when moving this agenda forward. I think I will try in 3 small points to answer to your question. The first one is a little bit related to the context. I think what is important to highlight when it comes to our role in commenting the EU leadership or not leadership at COP29. This is our work as European civil society organization. I would say that I look back at the last 2 weeks, at the 2 weeks in Baku, and all the prep process of the EU, like with a little bit of acknowledgement as well, that of course the context and the geopolitical context is changing, and also that the EU came to Baku in a very peculiar situation, meaning like with everything that is happening domestically and within our borders. So I just wanted to make it clear that we don't neglect that. This we know very well that is happening, as we know like that we went to Baku with this news about a change again in administration in the US and all of that. So all this geopolitical context, of course, has an impact. Nevertheless, I think history and the UNFCCC history is showing us that actually the EU leadership is needed. And the EU leadership is needed to be concrete and to be, and there is no alternative at the moment. There are not so many other leaders we can count on. So I think this is important to highlight. Sorry to put pressure again, but I think this is the reality, and the urgency and the climate impacts to be witnessed all over the globe are like the best reminder that there is no possible choice that is different from that. And also, because we are here discussing about the EU-Africa relationship, I think it's important to put this discussion in the context of diplomacy, and looking at diplomacy as a tool for strengthening and looking also for new leaders across the globe. So I think the EU has a role in diplomacy to, again, as a service to increase leadership and global climate champions across the globe. Then my second point is a little bit more, maybe just to become a little bit more concrete. If I look at the weeks in Baku, I will say that overall, what we observe when we look at the leadership of the EU and what we saw in the run-up to Baku and in Baku is that we feel that there is not enough attention to the concerns that are raised often by African policymakers, in particular on adaptation and adaptation finance. And those concerns are not sufficiently reflected in the political attention by the EU. That is, when I say that, I mean like high-level statements, the communication strategy of the EU, I think it needs to reflect much more those concerns on adaptation finance. The EU is in my opinion, overly focused on mitigation when it comes to the international fora. Of course, we do need adaptation and mitigation, and with efforts, and we do need those in parallel. But I think the EU needs to, as a little bit the task, and in this moment also as an answer to the COP29 outcomes, to think about where adaptation components can be strengthened also in high-level political statements and communication. Then I think what we would like to see more is also stressing adaptation benefits. I think this it's something that we actually have several opportunities in the upcoming months on making sure that the EU voice in the international fora can stress more adaptation benefit, meaning like for sustainable human development. So adaptation, we all know, is about smart development, is about protecting people to access to water, to access to food, to live in decent housing, but most importantly, to protect people against climate change impacts. So, and then adaptation benefits is also about ensuring a stable investment environment. So I think this is also something that could be linked again, like with mitigation, because ensuring stable kind of investment environment can drive both adaptation and mitigation investments. And then my last point when it comes to how did we observe the leadership of the EU when it comes to COP29, I do feel that the EU could have done more to come better prepared in Baku to identify new sources for public international climate finance. And when I say it, I think I have been saying that throughout the whole 2024 at least. I think putting the learnings of the 100 billion goal at the forefront could have been like also a strategic move from the EU in order to stress like the fact that climate adaptation rarely can be funded via non-grant instruments, and putting at the forefront that adaptation requires public grants. Civil society, but also many think tanks and many also UN institutions have been looking at how potential sustainable and social justice sources could be identified to support adaptation finance. And I mean, there are again like many publications and many reports that have been done on that regard. And I can also put one of the recent reports we did in Can Europe in the chat. But I think all these shows that there are innovative sources of finance that could contribute to adaptation finance. I'm mentioning just two, like applying the polluter pays principle, so taxing polluters, but also taxing wealth. as options that can generate public resources for adaptation finance. I think that could be a clear and concrete way for the EU to have a coordinated efforts to look into these innovative sources of public finance, so that we are better prepared for the next milestones to have a concrete EU climate leadership at the international forum.
Okay, thank you, Chiara, for your very concrete recommendations. So one of the points you made was that there is not enough attention of the concerns of African policymakers by European leadership. And it's great that we have as a next panelist, Julien, so representing DG for Climate Action from the Commission. And I would like to build on this point, my question. So it is true that in our conversations with African stakeholders, we hear that there is a sense of disillusion of what can come out from Europe. So then the question is, how can Europe rebuild this trust with Africa and drive immediate political momentum, specifically on the adaptation agenda? What are the practical entry points that can be pursued, perhaps now already in 2025, to make tangible progress? Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to all the panelists for the interesting point that they brought in this exchange. I have to say that this is also for me a very interesting exercise to have this direct connection with civil society organization and to hear firsthand where the concerns are. Maybe just by a word of introduction, as Hannah explained, I'm in the Director General for Climate Action. I don't follow the COP process myself specifically, but I work in the part of the directorate, of the International Directorate of DG Klima, that builds partnerships across the world on climate action. So this is really a complement to the work that we're doing in the multilateral setting, because we believe that those bilateral partnerships can help, on the one hand, build a momentum in the negotiations by having alliances with countries, but also that by themselves they are also meaningful, because at the end of the day, whether it's on mitigation or on adaptation, it's mainly at national level that the action takes place, and we need to see to what extent partnerships between the EU and countries around the world can help with achieving some results. So Hannah, you mentioned a sense of disillusionment with the EU, and also I think today we've also heard maybe a broader disillusionment with the multilateral negotiations on climate. I have to say that we are living in a world that is changing very quickly. I do get the sense that the disillusionment with the EU is, there's not one sort of relation between Africa and the EU. There are different relations according to the countries that you're dealing with, and that whilst you do see maybe some countries that either move away or redefine their relation with Africa, others are rather in a mode of seeking to increase the relations or just redefining in an effort to diversify with whom they trade, with whom they have political relations. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that there's not just one relation between Africa and the EU. It's much more than that. You mentioned the word trust, and I think in the climate negotiations, the word trust has often been associated with the word finance. And one of the key elements of lack of trust was triggered by the delays that have been there in meeting the 100 billion goal. Now, I mean, we know that now the figures show that this goal has been achieved, and even more than achieved in 2022. So that's a good result, and of course we would have liked to see it earlier. On adaptation specifically, what I would like to to say is that the EU is, very much shares the assessment from African partners that adaptation is a key priority for them. And we have also supported the call that was issued at the collective call that was issued at COP26 on doubling climate finance for adaptations by 2025. We see that there is some progress in reaching that goal. The latest figures, I think, show that we are halfway, more than halfway, in fact, to meeting the 40 billion target that this collective goal would represent by 2025. We are today at $32 billion in adaptation finance, out of which the large majority is coming from international public finance. So that's we see that the call seems to have triggered something, and that the figures are improving. Also from the EU side, I would like to say that we have definitely prioritized adaptation in our financing, in our climate financing. So there is in 2023, we estimated about $12 billion of our public climate finance went to adaptation. And out of this amount, about 40% of the finance was committed to for Africa. We definitely believe that the scale of the finance is not yet enough, and that there's also a need to still prioritize more the vulnerable countries and communities, because we know that those are the most exposed, and also those that have the least response capacities when climate disasters hit, for example. Now, looking a bit forward on entry points and how to make tangible progress. Well, from the EU side, we very much pushed at COP the need for a holistic approach to climate finance, and we will definitely continue to support the implementation of the agreement that was reached at COP, to make sure that all the sources of finance, including private, but also the reform of the international financial architecture remains a priority. But please don't interpret this as meaning that we will cease to focus on our concessional finance for adaptation, because we do recognize that for adaptation there is a specific difficulty to mobilize private finance. The second point where we definitely also see a lot of scope to make progress is to turn the national adaptation plans into investment plans. We know that there's still an issue of having bankable projects, a pipeline of bankable projects that would allow countries to attract public and private finance at scale. We have some concrete ongoing projects to work with initiatives like the Africa Adaptation Initiative, where we are working with directly accredited entities to the global climate funds to help them prepare their files for accessing these funds more easily. We're also working with the EIB, which is the European main development bank, let's say, to see that more of their funds target adaptation, and we will do this by supporting them at a technical level to identify early stage adaptation projects. At a more political level, I would say that, as was alluded already by other speakers, we have some opportunities ahead of us to engage with African partners. We have in 2025 a summit planned at Head of State. This was reiterated also as a key priority in the political guidelines for the von der Leyen Commission. So we really have to seize this opportunity to develop an agenda on climate together with our African partners, which would help us prepare also the discussions in COP30 in Belem, where adaptation will be among the priorities, together with of course the focus on the next cycle of NDCs. And there, of course, the better NDCs, the higher ambition NDCs we get at Belem, the better, the more we will be able to mitigate the costs that will be linked to the inevitable consequences of climate change. So we cannot forget that here definitely Africa has a very important voice and point to make in the discussion on climate with high emitters to support this agenda on mitigation.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Julia. Thank you also for giving us these concrete numbers. We know that the EU, together with the European member states, are the largest providers of climate finance, including for adaptation. And that was something that came up in the first session. I think it was a point made by Mitika that there is a lot of pressure on budgets. We have within Europe, within several member states, quite scary, I would say, shifts more towards the right, which will have implications also for climate finance. So with this, I would like to turn to Peter, representing Belgium, because we see that also I'm also from Belgium, within our countries, political agendas are shifting. But at the same time, I know that there is ambition within Belgian government to continue providing for climate finance. So what is the role of a small European state in pushing for financial commitments, also together with other European member states, and in the work that you do with the European Commission as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Hannah. Chiara was also referring to the peculiar situation we're in throughout the whole of the European Union, on the EU level and on the level of the member states. And it's also reflected in geopolitics, of course, a shift on the political spectrum, which is the political reality we're working in, and that applies to Belgium as well. We still have to see what our new government will decide. But before going to the question, what we can do as a small member state, I would briefly, if I may, reflect on what Chiara said in terms of EU leadership on adaptation, which comes as a little bit of a surprise to me, and maybe we have to work on telling our story in a more convincing manner. But in the context throughout of the last year, in the context of the NCQG discussions, we have always we've always told the story that public money needs to go to adaptation first, in the most vulnerable countries first. If that story in terms of leadership wasn't clear enough for the least developed countries in Africa, for example, I hope I can set that record straight. Belgium, for one, has always advocated that policy line, and we will continue to do so. Not only on the political level, where we together with the other 26 member states and the Commission, of course, decide on what political lines the EU takes in the international negotiations and in all the other fora that were discussed before, and where we have to talk about adaptation in the real world as well, and financing adaptation in the real world as well, not just in the confines of the UNFCCC process, but also in terms of what we do ourselves in that real world on the ground. We're not the biggest contributor, we're not the biggest member state either, but I don't think I would be bragging if I would say that we are actually one of the champions within the EU in focusing on adaptation in least developed countries in Africa, notably. I won't dwell on specific examples. So we are convinced, and we have been for a long time, if you look at our record in terms of climate finance, of the need to have a highly grant or highly concessional or grant-based focus on adaptation in least developed countries in Africa. I said we're not the biggest contributor, but our climate finance has about tripled, almost tripled over the last couple of years. I hope that also speaks to our leadership and how genuine it is in trying to push EU leadership forwards. I can add as a conclusion, as far as this question is concerned, Hannah, that we will continue to push for that EU leadership on all fronts within the UNFCCC, in all the other relevant fora for development finance, for reforming the international financial architecture, and as an actor on the ground as well. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. For the sake of time, we have about 4 minutes left before Katie will close the session. I would like to turn briefly to Julius. And I think that's a good question from the chat. So it's about to what extent are we really influencing as CSOs these climate negotiations? Now, if you could perhaps respond to this question with a short-term perspective in 2025 in the run-up to COP30, what do you see from a CSO perspective as really the pressure points, or how to build alliances with European civil society and really pushing for your agenda? Like, what should be the priority steps forward? Julius. That's yours.
Thank
Okay.
you. Can you hear me?
Yes, if you can just respond in 2 minutes, that would be perfect.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think there's a lot of things that have already been coming out very clear. As civil society, we still want to work with the fellow, CSOs in the north, to be able to come up with a very concrete, way of how we can work together in terms of advancing the spirit of champions from Europe that would actually help us to bring issues to do with adaptation on the table. I like the presentation made by Belgium on, for example, where they're already articulating the fact that as a government and as a country, they are able to, already they are championing adaptation in different ways. But we need those, case studies to come out, and that's what we would actually rely on, so that we can actually provide more concrete evidence that it's very possible to support adaptation, and even to actually upscale adaptation finance. And it's very even possible for countries to agree on a very sticky issue on means of implementation, for example, when it comes to the conversation that is going to be there in Belem about the DGA. So I think those are my points, but we still, where Africa and the EU summits are being organized, would actually be looking forward to even having CSO conversations, alongside those, meetings or side meetings that can actually help us to influence some of the discussions that will be held between the parties. So that is something that I would actually share, but it's very important that we have those champions that are interacting with us to raise the profile, but also to ensure that side meetings are also in place so that CSOs can also participate, aside those UNFCCC meetings that will be organized in 2025 ahead of Belem.
Yeah. Thank you, Julius. Great points. Now, I would like to turn as a last to Chiara with the same question. How can political momentum be driven on the adaptation agenda in the year 2025? So please, what are the immediate entry points? Please be very short, 1 minute. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Anna. So I can just give a list, and happy to have other conversations with all of you on this. But I think all the work around the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1.c represent an interesting avenue to build on what we got. The water under the bridge, I think, has been called. So let's go with that and align as much as possible financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement, including adaptation goals. Maybe a second point, I would really also, for all of us as civil society globally, an invitation to not forget about ODA. Also, ODA is under attack, so I think that is an important connection that when it comes to adaptation finance, to keep an eye on. The third has been mentioned also earlier, several times in the first panel. I think as civil society, we need to look at the broader financial systems reform, and there are key opportunities in 2025 to make those links. And maybe one very concrete idea I had this morning is really to look at the EU-Africa Summit. This is maybe also some homework for us as an opportunity, for instance, to check with the Danish EU presidency to organize a specific high-level event on adaptation finance. I think this could also deliver a little bit something concrete on adaptation finance, as well as contributing to strengthening the EU leadership in the run-up to Belem.
Okay, thank you again for being so concrete. I think that there have been some different perspectives on the adaptation discussions here, and that's why it's so important to have these kind of webinars. And I don't want to take any more time. Thank you so much for the audience, for the panelists also in the second session. I would like to now turn to Katie, who is Senior Fellow at SEI and also Director of Adaptation Without Borders. So thank you, Katie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's been an absolute privilege to listen to your conversation today. And I think what I've really taken from this, when we think about assessing where we are in the context of Africa-Europe relations on adaptation, finance and diplomacy, it's really a sort of two sides of a coin, or a game of two halves, sort of depending on your perspective. So I think for some, we've really heard that the deal on the NCQG that we got is worse than a no deal, that there remains real obscurity on what climate finance is, that COP29 did little to advance transparency or accountability. And these are indeed the views of some here at this call, that also, have the sort of really question the proposed solutions to expanding the volume of climate finance that we have, saying that they have questionable legitimacy, questionable feasibility, and that really there is this huge gap that still remains between the delivery of adaptation finance and the needs that we have for adaptation finance. For others, I think we've heard today that really this deal on the NCQG was the best that could be hoped for in the current circumstances, that there are significant opportunities that we have to harness, indeed to expand the volume of adaptation finance, whether that's looking at global tax reforms to thwart illicit financial flows, or or levies on shipping, or the exploration of other sorts of innovative financial flows, and really injecting momentum in the reforms of the multilateral financial architecture that both Africa and Europe have really been championing to date. We've also heard that there is reasons for optimism in thinking about how we can expand the adaptation community to really work with economic justice campaigners, development practitioners, young people, with actors at the local level to really drive this movement that we're seeing as we hope that adaptation will get its moment in the sun. And I think 2025, as we look at it, really also mirrors these dichotomies. So on the one hand, we know it's a really tough environment. We know we have the rise of insular politics, very tough fiscal environment. We have disillusionment in some quarters. We have a lack of trust in others. But on the other hand, we really have a number of waypoints in 2025 that are really important to strengthen adaptation diplomacy. We've heard about Spain's hosting of the 4th International Conference on Sustainable Development in Europe, South Africa's presidency of the G20, there's the Financing for Development Summit, UN General Assembly, the Baku to Belem Roadmap that came out of COP29, of course, the much anticipated COP30, and, as Chiara mentioned, the preparations for the 7th EU-AU summit. These all represent opportunities for us to continue to increase dialogue and hopefully strengthen action on adaptation, finance and diplomacy. And with the really significant changes that are being ushered in across the 2 new commissions, a new policy and programming cycle just beginning, we really have a lot to be hopeful for. So perhaps I think just some of the lessons that I've heard in the last minute. So we've heard that we cannot address these issues in silos. We cannot let 2025 be a talk shop. Progress is not being best nurtured through this continued polarization that we're seeing in the negotiations. We need more dialogue. We need more high-level champions. And these are all critical if adaptation is to become more than a footnote in the history of climate action and diplomacy and finance. So this is just the start of a series of dialogues. Thanks so much. I'm with SEI, but thanks so much to those at ECDPM and our co-hosts at PACJA for initiating this dialogue. We hope to have many more of them throughout 2025. And so we really look forward to welcoming you all back for many more conversations on adaptation diplomacy in the year ahead. Thanks, Hannah.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will be in touch again.